Part 2. 7. The musical Palmer family arrives by bandwagon at Alamo Ranch. Young Marietta Palmer is not impressed favorably by Richard. The Palmers camp near Sandal House. Richard agrees to take them to Chaco Canyon. Pueblo Bonito. Richard's excitement when he realizes he has found a vast, many-dwelling center of a vanished civilization. They visit Santa Fe. Richard and Talbot Hyde exchange letters planning their next summer's work. With Richard as guide, the bandwagon circles southward into Arizona, crossing the flooded San Juan. Richard asks Marietta to be his wife. The parting at Monticello, Utah. Part 2. I hope that in time to learn a little about this region that may be of value to someone who will know how to use it. Richard Wetherill, in a letter to Talbot Hyde, January 1903. Dick Wetherill is now in Arizona, but failed in his invoice of notes of travel for this issue. The Apaches are on the warpath in New Mexico and Arizona. Dick Wetherill had better head the bandwagon towards the Ute Reservation. Mancos Times, January 17th, 1896. On a late summer day in 1895, a wagon bearing the dust of hard travel pulled up at a store on the main street of Mancos. The arrival attracted more curiosity than the usual stranger's rig. Something about its lines and loading was different. This one combined the serviceable qualities of a heavy-duty ranch wagon with the grace of a stylish passenger vehicle. Its outline was high and rectangular. For stormy weather, it carried thin cedar panels, which could be fastened along the side and rear to shut out the rain. At the moment, with the noon sun nearly overhead, the wagon was open to any chance breeze. This allowed passers-by and loiterers to observe that the family of 5 sitting in the vehicle was rather out of the ordinary too. On the front seat with the father, his frail wife was folding a sealskin coat in her lap. She had worn the fur against the morning chill coming over the mountain road from Durango. Behind the parents, seated in the main part of the wagon, in the bored attitude of those who had been riding a great distance, were a girl of 18 and a small boy and girl. Under his arm, the boy held a silvery object of valves and coils, half as big as himself, a musical horn distantly related to the tuba. On this, not long before, he had been practicing his scales. Twisting the reins round the brake handle, the father stepped down and went into the store. To the man he found behind the counter, he said, "My name is S.L. Palmer from Verde, Kansas. Would you be so kind to tell me how I can find the Wetherill place?" The clerk came around the counter, dusting his palms on the seat of his pants, and led Palmer back to the door. "Lots of folks have been coming to look at Mesa Verde since the Wetherill boys started digging up there," he observed in a general way. "I've just brought my family 700 miles for that reason," Palmer said. After a slow, speculative stare at the stranger's rig and its occupants, the clerk raised an arm and pointing finger. "Take the turn there at the post office and go down that road till you come to the church," he said. "Then turn sharp right again and follow straight along the river. The Alamo Ranch is down that road, and you can't miss it. The house sets in a cottonwood grove off to the left a piece, on a little bend. You'll see 4 or 5 barns and sheds there, too." "Oh, thank you, friend," Palmer nodded. "It's 3 miles, the clerk said. The clerk stood in the doorway, watching until the wagon was out of sight, and then ambled back to the store. "This town's getting to be a regular resort place," he muttered to the tiger cat dozing in the window. Sidney Laverne Palmer and Elizabeth Ann, his wife, were Quakers. They had met some 20 years before when she was a student at the New England Conservatory of Music in Boston, and he was touring the East as a member of John Philip Sousa's band. Even when they moved to Illinois after their marriage, he had put away his coronet for a while to become a telegraph operator for the railroad. Music remained an important part of their lives. They taught each of their children to play a variety of musical instruments, starting them early. As time went on, and after moving to Kansas, they spent much of each year traveling about the country, giving family concerts or entertainments in towns and lonely settlements wherever they chanced to stop. The concerts helped pay their expenses and at the same time brought music and gaiety to small, remote communities that were hungry for both. The eldest daughter, Marietta, had her mother's large brown eyes and small stature, but she was plump, had her family's vitality and his features with certain refinements, the mouth firm, full, tending to smile, the forehead rising rather high and broad. She was born in Serena, Illinois, October 5th, 1876. 6 years later, her father moved to Scott City, Kansas, and after a few months to Verde, 7 miles from Fort Larned, Great Plains country, only recently wrested from the Cheyenne and Sioux. Here, Laverne Jr. and Edna were born, and the family settled on a wheat farm that also boasted a small fruit orchard. Marietta had a pleasing soprano voice, and while she could play a number of musical instruments quite well, she preferred the harp and the guitar. Her father was less than average height, but he was powerfully built and had a large, handsome head. Although most of his acquaintances wore beards, or at least a mustache, Sidney Laverne Palmer was uncompromising with the razor. He had neither. His Kansas neighbors remarked that for a farmer he did precious little farming. He was fastidious about his clothes, preferring suits of dark cloth and city tailoring to the workaday garments of provincial life, liking a shine on his black shoes, even when all the dust of Kansas conspired against it. More remarkable still, he wore a derby hat when farm business took him to town. The fact is, Marietta's father owned a Kansas farm, but the farm, in no sense, ever owned him. It was not long after he moved to Kansas that he began to take his family on concert tours, which each year somehow ended in longer absences from the home in Purdette. One year when Marietta was quite small and they were traveling in the deep South, they met and joined forces with a patent medicine drummer who gave tent shows. The drummer, as they did, rode from one town to the next in a wagon, but his was painted gorgeously in red and gilt. When the Palmers first encountered him, quite by accident in the town they were giving a concert, they were charmed to discover that his chief patent remedy was a concoction he put in little brown bottles and called a blood purifier, guaranteed to cure anything from bowel disturbances to morning vapors. Combining the talents of the musical Palmers and patent medicine was to their mutual advantage. For a short time, until Sidney Laverne Palmer decided to take his wife and children to Florida, the arrangement provided gratifying rewards. About a year later, the Palmers made their first journey overland by wagon into the Southwest. The country appealed to them so strongly they returned each summer. The wagon Palmer designed for these western trips was built to withstand a knocking about on the roughest trails, and at the same time afford some comfort. Constructed on the conventional Studebaker running gear, the wagon was built out over the wheels, with 2 seats placed lengthwise along each side of the body and separated from the front seat by floor-to-top cabinets. At the back were more cabinets to carry clothing, bedding, dishes, and cooking utensils, and provisions enough to keep a family of 5 for a week at a time. The seats were upholstered in light tan leather. Above them, at the back, just under the roof, were cases lined in blue plush and fitted with glass doors. It was here the musical instruments were stored when the family was traveling. A collapsible table let down from the top for meals, but otherwise was folded out of the way. At night, the seats could be arranged into comfortable beds. There was a space reserved for Palmer's photographic equipment. He was a good amateur photographer with some interest in archaeology. At the ruins he visited in the Southwest, he took photographs and collected prehistoric relics. These last found their way eventually into several museums, but the best of the relics were given by his children after his death to the museum at Mesa Verde. When Sidney Palmer brought his family to Mancos and the Alamo Ranch, he had not met the Wetherills, but he knew of their work with the cliff dwellings. Because other visitors had come ahead of them, there was not enough room for the Palmers in the ranch house, so they were invited to set up camp in a juniper and pinon grove on a knoll close by to stay as long as they liked. Richard was at the Hopi snake dance, but was expected to return any day. Marietta's father had expressed a wish that Richard be their guide when they explored the Mesa. Meanwhile, with John or Al or Wynne for company, he made short excursions down the valley and into Weber Canyon. There was enough surface mounds here, marked by low tumbled walls and fragments of pottery, to occupy his interest for some time. Occasionally, in early September evenings, the Palmers went to the house for a few hours around the big stone fireplace in Benjamin Wetherill's room. It was good company, and the warmth of the fire encouraged yarn spinning. Al and John were good storytellers. So was their father, whose memories of the frontier days on the Great Plains seemed inexhaustible. As Benjamin Wetherill talked of old times, his voice mellowed, losing a bit of its tart rasp. Something in his slight, spare frame belied his age. His figure was youthful, at odds with his big head and gnarled hands, with the restless thumbs he clasped across his vest. In the firelight, he reminded Marietta of a Roman senator with the body of a puckish gnome. His close-cropped thatch of hair, the ruddy cheeks and the button-bright eyes, and the square white beard were from a steel engraving in the Roman Forum. Marietta had heard how Richard and Charlie Mason had found Cliff Palace. The Wetherills also told of one terrible winter when the blizzard buried the Mancos Valley to depths so great that the Mormon families living in Weber Canyon were marooned. Richard realized their plight, killed a cow, and with Al's help managed to get the meat to the stranded people through the deep drifts. In these and other stories, Richard appeared in dramatic roles that might impress a more romantic girl, but Marietta scarcely listened. Her interest was centered on young Wynne, so nearly her own age, handsome and gay companion who paid her much attention. The stories about Richard registered only vaguely in the back of her mind. Marietta Palmer was not impressed either on the evening when she first met Richard. It was dark around the barns when those in the ranch house heard the horses outside, and the squeak of saddle leather, and a few short words of tired men, and a thud-thud of heavy packs were loosened and dropped to the ground. A voice was heard asking for a light, and someone came out of the ranch house with an oil lamp. There were just three of them, Richard, Clayton, and Bert Cowing. Muldoon Kelly had not turned in at the gate, but had continued home on a borrowed rig. Richard, like the others, was well caked with red dust, and a cloud of it lifted as he beat his hat against one leg. His hair was tangled, and a heavy beard covered his face. Short, broad through the chest and shoulders, with round, strong features set on a powerful neck. In the poor light, he might have been mistaken for Ulysses S. Grant, worn and haggard after the Wilderness Campaign. Tired as he was, his motions were swift as he took care of the horses. As Clayton Burt Cowing turned them into the corral and then forked in hay. Afterwards had been a brief exchange of greetings, Richard saying hello to the girl, and then with the two others disappearing into the house, the Palmers went back to their camp on the knoll. They did not look like much to me, Marietta wrote later in this meeting, but Mother Wetherill sent word to our camp that because the boys had been gone on this Arizona trip so long, she was going to give a dinner to celebrate the homecoming, and would we join them? We did, and what a big difference there was. It was the night following the turn when they all gathered at the supper table. Except for Richard's quiet black gaze and Kate's laugh and ready smile, she would not have recognized them. During the day, they'd scrubbed themselves in the river. Now, freshly dressed and free of villainous beards, they appeared far less formidable. Marietta began to notice flashes of humor in Richard's manner. But in repose there were creases and a weather-beaten look that made him appear older than he really was. She observed with a surprise, Richard then was just 37, that his hair was quite gray. Later that evening, and again around the fire in Benjamin Wetherill's room, the conversation turned to the Mesa and its cliff dwellings. When Marietta's father spoke of Cliff Palace, Richard offered to take them there the next day if they wished. He began to tell of the many things he and his brothers had found in the canyons of the Dark Mesa. As he talked, the images he created of a vanished civilization caused Marietta to lose all sense of time.
And I feel like New York City. Get me to the farm.